Good afternoon. Thank you for attending our session today, which is on navigating the return to office mandates. To introduce myself, my name's Julian. I'm part of the My HR team here in Australia. So I'm heading up the HR advisory team. And with me today, I have my colleague Maddie, who's an HR advisor who works with me here in Sydney. Today's session is one that I think is quite topical. We hear a lot from our clients on this matter, and that is trying to, get their employees back into the office, in a sort of post-COVID environment. And it appears to be sort of easier said than done, I suppose. So we've been hearing a lot about it. We've been reading a lot about this matter, seeing surveys and articles, and that sort of thing. Our view is that, employees have experienced the advantages of increased work flexibility since the pandemic, including less time spent commuting, more time spent with friends and family, and investing in themselves. The delicate balance between employee expectations around flexible work going forward and employer desires to get their employees into the office and improving their sort of work culture and improving sort of productivity, so to speak, seems to be a sticking point. And with a third of Australian businesses saying they've had employees resign due to inflexible return to office policies, we thought it's a good time to run a bit of a session on the matter as well. So just to run through a bit of admin before we do tackle today's subject matter. Today's session is being recorded. The recording will be available afterwards on the MyHR website. And any questions will be recorded as well. So only use details that you're comfortable in sharing and submit a question anonymously. If there are any questions, we'll answer those at the end of today's session. So there would be a chat and also a Q&A bubble. So feel free to throw any questions into the chat. And yeah, like I said, we can tackle those at the end. So Maddie, maybe if you can sort of start by talking us through today's topics.
Yeah, sure. So the topics that we are going to go through today are defining exactly what the problem is and the problem that, we're finding that our clients and other employers alike are facing. The common mistakes that we're seeing employers make with these return to office mandates. We're going to run through some of the pros and cons of hybrid working for both the employer and the employee. We'll touch on some of the legal stuff, so what you're actually able to mandate and what the employee rights are, and then just some ideas on how to make hybrid work for you. And then we'll pause for those questions at the end. Do just want to caveat as well that there might be some people on here who have employees that have to perform, an in-person, in-office role. We do appreciate that that does exist. So obviously this kind of doesn't apply to those people. This is really only for people that do have the flexibility to be able to perform their role from home.
Yeah, totally. I think that's an important caveat. It's all well and good for us to sort of talk about that in respect of our roles and similar roles and that sort of thing. But the reality is there's still a lot of people who need to front up and attend the actual workplace day to day. So yeah, that's an important caveat as well. So I think in terms of talking about what the problem here, there's been a lot of surveys, a lot of articles written about this sort of thing, and I think we've sought really just to sort of summarize what we've been reading, and sort of summarizing what we've sort of been hearing from friends and family, as well as clients who when we deal with day to day. And as has been pointed out, employees really like the flexibility that sort of has come with working from home in terms of health and work and life balance, greater ability to sort of travel, work at times that suit them. Many have put in place various arrangements and reorganized their lives around previous work from home orders that sort of came out of COVID-19 arrangements. We hear quite regularly from clients whose employees have moved to remote areas, have taken on sort of additional responsibilities around the community and that sort of thing. And in many instances, employees see a greater downside to coming back to the office than employers and executives and that sort of thing. So often employees are sort of confronting longer commutes, greater cost coming to work relative to their employers. So in the current market, employees are commonly prioritizing workplaces that support work from home arrangements and various other flexible working arrangements. So, recent survey has found sort of one third of Australian businesses have at least one employee leave in response to office work mandates. 87% of businesses have issued some form of in-office mandate. So that's the vast majority, of course. And then 40% of employers would expect further employees to leave due to in-office requirements going forward as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that with that, they're kind of accepting that there would be the additional cost of recruitment, loss of productivity with having, new staff start not knowing their job. So it's kind of an interesting, choice to make, to be willing to accept that there would be that, resignation from their staff if they do mandate those in-office requirements, because I think employees are kind of struggling to see some of the benefits that the employers are pushing that they'll get from returning to the office.
Yeah, totally. And, sort of touching on a few other surveys and things we've been reading lately, certainly a Centre for the New Workforce survey suggests 4 in 5 Australian workers expect flexible working arrangements as part of their job, which has increased significantly over the last couple of years. And the main reason is employees see it as producing better wellbeing outcomes as well.
Well, I think like we spoke about the other day, Julian, it's kind of a mixed message when, 2-3 years ago, everybody was mandated to work from home completely because of, COVID and everything that was going on, that was posing a health risk. So it just seems like a bit of a 180 to flip on everybody and say, you actually now have to come back in, even though for a majority, they've been able to show that they can perform their duties from home without really a loss of productivity. So I think employees are struggling to understand the reasons behind it, and employers are struggling to show employees why they want that in-office face-to-face time.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's sort of, I think a takeout from us just looking to this further and having those conversations is it appears that employers need to, make the case a lot more than what they did in the past to try and convince employees that it's worth their while, it's worth their time to attend the workplace or attend the office, which seems counterintuitive. But with this, there's sort of numbers of, 80% of employees expecting greater flexibility, greater number of employees willing to take on sort of work from home or sort of hybrid working arrangements as part of their work life, then there definitely needs to be a response from employers. I think to sort of add to the complexity, and again, sort of looking further into this sort of stuff and surveys, different generations have different expectations. And I think, Maddie, I was telling you earlier that surprisingly, the generation that's most interested in working from home rather than heading back into the office is the baby boomer generation, which seems counter to most things.
What we would assume.
What we would assume, yeah.
Yeah.
But certainly 76% of those respondents across all generations say that their current working arrangements require them in the office more than they would like. So, it sort of suggests that there've been some mandates to return to the office put in place. Employees are sort of questioning the amount of time that they're spending in the office as opposed to, working from home or that sort of thing. And as you say, where they've seen in the past that they've been able to make it work and work as productively as they have previously in the office.
Yeah, definitely. And I think obviously those reasons for wanting to work from home look different for everybody. For some people, it's wanting to spend time with your family. Some people just like being able to go and do a lunchtime exercise class, walk their dog, that sort of stuff. It doesn't really matter what the reason is, but I think everyone's been able to see that it can work for them. And it's just given people a better quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now we're just going to look at some of the common mistakes that we have seen with this hybrid setup and kind of why it doesn't work or why employers are feeling like they're not getting the productivity out of their employees that they would want to see. I think the main one definitely is not having a good work from home setup. Julian, I think, when we were all kind of mandated to work from home, it was obviously a bit of a kind of knee-jerk reaction to obviously government requirements, and not really much thought was given to what that work from home setup looks like, because a lot of people didn't have the ability to work from home before. So, people are working from their bed, they're working from, their dining table. A lot of the time people have an extra screen at work. It's obviously shown that that does increase productivity. So if people don't have access to those tools, they obviously can't be as productive at home. So I guess now a lot of the time people would expect that their employer gives them some sort of reimbursement or access to these things to be able to have a good work from home setup so they can be equally as productive at home.
Yeah, totally. I think that's key. And I think that's something that, the employers who get it right see it and know it and understand that the investment needs to be made if they're expecting, that sort of productivity level from their employees. But the ones who sort of don't get it sort of continue to sort of, I guess they're living in that world of we're sort of going back to the sort of pre-COVID arrangements. So it's still in their sort of mind like a temporary arrangement of people working from home when realistically, I think you sort of need to go into it with the mindset that, a significant portion of this person's time is going to be spent away from the office, and so therefore we need to equip them with the right equipment, make sure they've got the right setup, make sure there's that sort of open lines of communication with their colleagues and their manager, and having the overall sort of setup to ensure that they're in a good position to perform the work, some of their work at home at least. I think the other side, and a lot of this stuff we'll talk about today is sort of, we'll be touching on consultation, and it's sort of like making the direction or making the call, and we're coming back to the office, and this is what we're doing, and this is the number of days we're going to be here, and that sort of thing. And I think consultation always yields better results, in my opinion. And given the sort of shock of the last 3 years and how much people's lives have changed, people have put in place all sorts of arrangements around their sort of work and outside of work life. And I think we need to sort of acknowledge that some sort of consultation around these sorts of directions is necessary.
Yeah, I think it's definitely better received when employees feel as though they can have a bit of a say in the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of ties in with the sort of phony sort of flexibility, as we've sort of called it here, is we hear a lot from employers around offering flexibility. But then when you sort of dig a little deeper, there isn't a lot of flexibility to this sort of hybrid working arrangement. It's like, you need to be in
this many days a week.
This
you need
many
to
days a
tell
week.
us a week in advance. If we don't agree with the days that you've picked, we're just going to tell you to come in a different day anyway, because that day doesn't work for somebody else. So it's kind of like telling people that they have all this flexibility, but then still kind of dictating when you want them to come in to suit your narrative, and not really giving them the opportunity to say, well, this day doesn't work for me because of X, Y, Z. It's about, it's a two-way street, really, what should be, to get the most out of your employees.
Yeah, and often that goes with, a lot of people I know, their employers have reduced office capacity in the time of COVID, or their workforce has grown, but the office size hasn't grown with it, and then they're sort of trying to attend work and there's not enough space for them on particular days. And so, having some sort of system in place to manage that, I think, is crucial. I was thinking like being a bit more sort of strategic around where work is performed and why. And we hear a lot about, sort of on-site work being a bit more focused around collaboration and connecting with colleagues and managers and that sort of thing. And whereas the sort of work from home being a bit more sort of head down, deep work, sort of independent tasks and that sort of thing. So, sort of probably being a bit more intentional around the sort of work being performed, rather than just like a sort of blanket number of days in the office versus at home.
But I also think it should come down to giving your employees a bit more autonomy to be able to assess their own week and their own workload. Like if I have a day where I'm just going to be in, Teams calls all day, there's no benefit to me to come into the office and just sit in a meeting room on calls. It doesn't really make sense. So, but if I was directed to come in that day, I just wouldn't get the benefit that my employer would be saying that I should be getting out of coming in. So I think it's really about, again, as we've said before, having that communication with your manager, with your team, and giving people the, ability to make these decisions for themselves. Because at the end of the day, everyone's an adult. They should be able to make that call. They should have that judgment.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think the clearly defined hybrid work policy is an important one. We'll sort of look at an example later on. I mean, we are totally not about policy overkill in my HR when we sort of, our clients are sort of small, medium-sized businesses, and we know that having too many policies really, causes a lot of headaches down the road. But having something really basic that sort of sets out the sort of general guidelines around how we go about working under a sort of hybrid environment, I think is crucial as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, obviously making the office an appealing place to employees. We could sort of go into that in any number of ways, and sort of talking about the sort of intentionality around events and ways of attracting employees back into the workplace. And I think sort of mentioned earlier just around sort of pre-COVID arrangements and a lot of people sort of still stuck in that. Well, we're just going to go back to where we were.
Realistically, that's never going to happen.
Yeah. The way I see it, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. So we have just kind of outlined what we have kind of found to be some pros and cons of hybrid working. Obviously, this is for both. Some of these cover employee and employer pros and cons. But yeah, these are kind of some of the common themes that we have come across that's involved in the argument. So obviously the main pro is, enhanced work-life balance. It's touched on before, spending more time with kids and family, being able to go do a gym workout class, being able to meet friends for lunch and then come back and, continue your work. I think people have really seen the benefit of that. And it just, helps break up the work day so much more compared to just sitting at your desk all day, doing work. So we've really seen the benefit to that one. I personally really have found that it to be a great benefit. I don't know about you, Julian.
Yeah, totally. No, I completely agree. I think again, sort of looking at a couple of studies recently, I think 4 in 5 hybrid workers feel that they're more productive, experience less work-related stress, have more time to relax. And so this includes sort of spending more time with family and friends, exercising more, improved eating habits as well. So, and 78% of employees would not work for an employer without a formalized flexible work policy as well. So I think that the sort of, in terms of the pros list, I think a lot of that sort of stuff speaks for itself. I think, I think a lot of employers would question the productivity angle and sort of question, whether employees are as productive working from home as what they would be in the office. Yeah,
I think you could argue with that one, though. I think if you're instructing people to come into the office, then one of the main reasons behind that employers seem to use is, culture and socializing. So if you're expecting people to be in the office, you have to kind of forgo a bit of that productivity in theory, because people are going to be socializing and chatting and going and getting coffees and going and getting lunch together. All of that obviously taken off of working time. So, if companies are saying that they want people to come in for the culture, they then can't be, penalized for then wanting to involve themselves in that culture and spend time with their colleagues. So I think you could argue either way that you could see decreased productivity at home or in the office.
And it sort of goes to that sort of, intentionality around where people are performing work and why. I think the sort of greater access to talent one is a really good one. You're extending your sort of potential pool of workers with a hybrid work model. So maybe someone who lives, say, an hour and a half, further away from the office, would be more willing to take on a role if there's no requirement for them to sort of have to commute 5 days a week. I think it's a more efficient use of people's time. I know myself, I get the train to work into the office sometimes, and Sydney sort of train delays and congestion and that sort of thing, and you sort of get there and it's like you're already exhausted just about, whereas you sort of work from home and you sort of do what you need to do in the morning, and you feel
It's a slower start to the day.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think Maddie, like sort of cons. I mean, the cons list is an interesting one. Like, I think it's like depends on how you look at it. And it's sort of a cons list, I think, of uh, you know, yeah, I think it sort of depends on how you, like, say, like less visibility of employees, for example. I think a lot of employers would see that as a con. But what do you think about that in terms of?
Well, I think the employee would maybe say that they're not being as micromanaged, so they might find it to be a benefit. But I think that's kind of where you need to have the trust and the open lines of communication to ensure that just because you aren't looking at them doesn't mean that you're not, confident in their ability to complete their job without you hovering over them. Like that shouldn't be, the management style and the way that you're engaging with your staff anyway.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's, different ways that you can, assess employees' performance as well. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, the onus really is on employers to make sure they've got in place what they need to be able to
Perform their role at home.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean,
think, yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say it can definitely be a problem with employees that are underperforming and are kind of renowned for not checking in, because we do see that quite often as well. But that's not just strictly to do with working from home. You see that with these employees who are in the office as well. But I think that's kind of where the problem stems from, is one person ruins it for everyone.
Yeah, and you don't want to have that one person. You don't want to have your policy or your approach to this sort of thing dictated by
One
the
person.
one or two people who aren't doing the right thing.
Mm.
I think the company culture is an interesting one, and I think it's a work in progress. Um, it's still a challenge, I think, for a lot of businesses to, really sort of cultivate that company culture
Remotely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that.
I think the other one I sort of definitely observed sort of early on in COVID was the fewer developmental opportunities for sort of younger employees, and that was certainly a concern of mine with sort of people I worked with, and whether they would get a fair crack at sort of building a career. It's sort of like work from home, not seen, and out of mind, out of sight, out of mind, sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I think when you're kind of in those critical junior roles, it is really important to be able to have that in-person, face-to-face collaboration. I remember when I was, a lot more junior in my career, you learn so much just by overhearing people, more senior than you speak and collaborate on things. You pick up how to like handle a process just by kind of being in the room, as opposed to having to pick up the phone, speak to somebody. When you're working from home, it tends to be, more specific about why you're calling someone or why you're contacting someone. You wouldn't just contact them just to kind of have a random chat like you would in the office. So that's definitely a downside for those more junior individuals.
Yeah, and look, our view is that these are sort of challenges to be overcome, and require a sort of different way of thinking about this sort of stuff as well.
Yeah. So the legal stuff. So I guess we just wanted to talk about essentially what both the employer and employees' rights do come down to with this issue. So Julian and I were kind of talking about this, and I think it kind of comes down to the employment contract is kind of where it all stems from. Essentially, most people, if they were employed pre-COVID, their contract would be a full-time in-office contract if the location of work was filled out correctly at the time that the contract was issued. We do sometimes see this as quite vague. With the location, some people would just put, New South Wales, so the employee could kind of argue they can technically work from anywhere. Whereas if it's a specific work address, and that hasn't changed, there were no, variations to contract done during this, work from home kind of era, then legally, technically, at the end of the day, the employer could mandate all employees to return to the office.
Yeah, it totally. I think it all comes down to whether it's a lawful and reasonable direction. I mean, the contract's king, and then it's
what's reasonable.
What's lawful and reasonable. And certainly, for the most part, a direction to return to the office would be a lawful and reasonable one, assuming that the contract of employment reflects that. Provided that the employee doesn't have some sort of underlying sort of health concern or something, like that, that's preventing them from returning to the workplace. That's not to say that consultation shouldn't occur with employees. While it may not necessarily be legally necessary to consult with workers, consultation we find does yield better results. For award covered employees, the change may be considered a major workplace change in terms of a change to come back to the workplace, depending on how it was dealt with at the time that sort of COVID struck, and therefore any sort of award requirements around consultation would apply in terms of providing notice, discussing the change with the employee, and considering any other matters that the employee puts forward as well. And I think that's just acknowledging that employees have put in place various arrangements over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
There was also a recent case that sort of tested whether a work from home was a workplace right. And so that case really clarified that there's no standalone legal right to work from home in Australia. And effectively, this employee brought a general protections claim against her employer, alleging that she had a workplace right to work from home. The court confirmed that the employee did not, or employees generally do not possess a general right to work from home at their election, and that the employee is in that case failed to establish that she had any right under the workplace laws or under her contract of employment as well.
Yeah, but I do find that one quite interesting, because I think that in a sense it kind of then contradicts the flexible working entitlement, which obviously employees have the right to request from their employer. And we found recently the kind of legislation and governance around this has changed. And now there's a lot more of an onus on the employer to prove why they can't support a flexible working arrangement. It used to just be no reasonable business grounds, which is, kind of a buzzword that we hear all the time. Now there had to be a lot more evidence shown to support why they couldn't support a flexible working request, which a lot of the time now is an employee right.
Yeah, totally. So employees with caring responsibilities, for example, who request a flexible work arrangement. It's always been the case that employers can only refuse those on reasonable business grounds. That's a sort of quite a general term. But now there's much more of an onus on employers to discuss the request with the employee, look at alternative arrangements, and generally try to reach alternative arrangements. Like a reduced hours of 3 days a week may not be suitable for the employer, but hey, here's another arrangement that might be an alternative to consider. And also demonstrating they've considered the consequence of refusing the employee's request as well. And employees can bring matters to the Fair Work Commission to seek resolution through conciliation or arbitration on flexible work matters as well. So I suppose it comes down to, Maddie, like how do we go about trying to make hybrid work?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's going anywhere, and I don't think the expectation from employees is going anywhere either. So I think that it really is in employers' best interest to try and come up with a model and a policy that does attempt to kind of work for everybody. You're not ever going to be able to have it work for everybody, but I think, having measures in place to show that employers are trying to meet employees halfway is a really good step in the right direction. So we've kind of identified that obviously developing a policy is a good place to start. As Julian said, we don't want to overdo policies. So I guess kind of trying to keep it as general as possible. There isn't really a one size fits all approach. Unfortunately, everybody's individual circumstances are really different. So it is really hard to find something that will work for everyone. But I guess kind of start by having a baseline of what is acceptable. And then there's always going to be those one-offs where an employee might come to you and have a conversation about what their individual circumstances are, and you can kind of have a discussion around what the business would be willing to support in terms of kind of deviating from that policy to try and retain, that talent, I think is a really good olive branch to extend.
Yeah, totally. So, again, been doing a bit of reading. Came across an article by a fellow who runs a company called Revium in Melbourne, I think it is. Um, in terms of their sort of hybrid working approach, they've developed a policy. The policy, requires employees to come into the office for a minimum of 1 day a week and a maximum of 4 days a week, leaving it to the employee's discretion on which day they choose to come in. Um, they argue that and I'm not sure how they've measured it, but they've increased staff satisfaction, have better retention, and more people applying to work for them since they've adopted this hybrid work policy. And they think it's worked for two sort of key reasons. One is they've invested heavily in making it work. And I think that's the important thing is going to that point around sort of one size, there's no sort of one size fits all. And we hear a lot about, 4-day working weeks and, different approaches. I think it really sort of comes down to sort of trial and error, trialing different approaches, seeing what works, what doesn't work. They've invested a lot into integrating calendars with a software for employees to secure desk space in the office. And they've also invested a lot in initiatives to embed culture through regular events and rewards and recognition programs and that sort of thing. Ultimately, they say that it's built on trust as well. But yeah,
I think that's kind of a good segue into flexibility shouldn't be treated as a reward that a company offers. A lot of the time in job ads now, you'll see under like the benefits section, they'll have flexibility, work from home. I don't really think that people see it as a benefit anymore. It's more of an expectation and like a need to have. So it shouldn't be treated as a reward or a benefit. It should kind of just be built into your general offering, and then you can obviously have other benefits on top of that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think leadership is key as well, and modeling the sort of behavior. I know I've spoken to friends who, their company has implemented a particular policy around work, and then just for like the managing director to sort of go away and do their own thing and sort of, completely adopt a work approach that's contrary to what everyone else is doing. So I think when employees see that, they get a little bit can get a little bit upset around that. So I think sort of modeling the behavior, showing that it works, also engaging with employees around what works for them and what doesn't, so it sort of can make it sort of mutually beneficial is key as well.
Yeah, and also I think importantly, mental health obviously has been very topical over the last couple of years, and I think we're finally in a space where people are more comfortable to discuss mental health issues, and I think a lot of employers are kind of stepping in the right direction by having access to EAP services and stuff like that. But I think it's important to consider the impact that directing everybody to be fully in office or fully remote can and has had an impact on mental health, which is why hybrid is kind of the sweet spot for that.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Look, that is pretty much what we wanted to cover today. A bit of a short and sharp one. We know that sometimes these webinars can sort of drag out a little bit. We sort of run it about half an hour now, a little bit over. So I suppose it's time for any sort of questions. If there are any questions out there, it looks like we've got a couple. And so a couple, so I might just jump into those, but feel free to type any further ones. I don't know if you can see those, Maddie. If not, I might just hit you with the questions. Well, I'll hit you with the first one anyway.
Sure.
What happens if during the interview process you say that we are flexible and have a work from home policy? There's nothing in their contract, but there is a policy saying that you can work from home a couple of days a week.
Well, that's not to say that you can't put a clause in their contract, but at the end of the day, any variation to a contract then has to be agreed upon and enter into consultation. So that's why if you have it in a policy, there's obviously more of a realm to change that down the track if required. So again, it kind of comes down to this trust aspect that we've all kind of talked about. What do you think, Julian?
Yeah, again, I think a policy provides you with more flexibility to that sort of trial and error aspect to see what does work. If you did have it in a contract, then yeah, you're potentially tying yourself to something that you may wish to change down the track, which can always be more difficult if it's in the employment contract. What do you think about the 9-day fortnight? What are the risks?
So, I mean, obviously the risks are depending on what kind of industry you work in, what kind of business you are. If there's client needs that need to be fulfilled, you need to make sure that you do have coverage over all of those, 5 days, 9 to 5, or whatever those hours are. I do know a few people that do a 9-day fortnight, but they do half days on Fridays, and I have seen it cause some issues where obviously it's kind of a benefit that's being extended. In their instance, it's not in their contracts, it's just something that they've kind of agreed to, but then there's been times where they've been directed to have to work the second half of the Friday, and obviously people have gone and made plans having in their head that they're working a half day, and they're kind of annoyed about it, but obviously it is the business right to direct you to work during that time if you're contracted to work a full time week. So it can definitely get you into a bit of a gray area if there are times when you need those employees to work that day instead.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like if you can make it work and it sort of works for the employer and the employee, then yeah, great. I mean, and that's what this sort of hybrid, approach is all about. It's like it's in employer response to flexibility and trying to create some sort of structure around that, I suppose.
I think with a 9-day fortnight, if you were trying to implement it, I wouldn't advise having everybody off at
On
the
the
same
same day.
time,
Yeah.
like spread it across the week so people have different days off. So then you've always got coverage across all the days.
I think my HR tried like maybe like a 4-day week in New Zealand a couple of years ago.
It didn't work.
And I think they found it didn't work that well in
It's kind
terms
of
of
hard for
rostering.
continuity of work depending on approvals and that sort of stuff. Stuff can kind of get stuck. And obviously clients have an expectation if they're open 5 days a week or whatever it is that you're there 5 days a week.
Yeah. Look, I think that's all of the questions we have.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for attending today's session. If you'd like to learn more about MyHR, you can jump on Google, find us in there. And yeah, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thanks for attending, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you.